Czechast, a podcast in English about Czech and Moravian society, history, culture and economy.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Czechast, the podcast where we explore all things Czech. I'm Vít Bohanka, your host, and today I'm joined by a truly fascinating guest, Dr. Eleanor Janega, an American broadcaster, historian and author who lives in London, but who has a deep personal and professional connection to Czech history. Eleanor's scholarship focuses on the late medieval period, including gender, urban life and apocalyptic thought, but her passion for Czech history runs much deeper than her academic work. As Eleanor explains, her interest in Czech history comes from her own family roots.
Well, I was always particularly interested in it because of the family connection. My father's parents are immigrants. So my grandmother was Czech, my grandfather was Slovak, and they immigrated to the Dakotas, which was a rather popular thing to do for people from Central Europe, and then eventually ended up moving to Chicago, which was, again, one of the big destinations for Czech and Slovak immigrants. My father grew up in an area of town which is called the Little Village, and it was pretty much all Czech speakers. The local church was Blessed Agnes of Bohemia. And so I grew up sort of speaking baby Czech with my grandmother, which it turned out was very old-fashioned. I learned.
In this episode, we explore the legacy of Charles IV, one of the most significant figures in Czech and European history, and why Eleanor chose him as the subject of her research. She reflects on his vision for Bohemia and his unique approach to governance.
This is what is incredibly interesting to study for me, because it shows you how good governance and real planning of a place can make a huge difference for regular people as well.
We also discuss Charles IV's relationship with the 14th century preacher Jan Milic of Kroměříž, whose work reflects the social and religious changes of the time.
So Charles is faced with this problem because he's got a brothel that is legally allowed to be there, but he doesn't really want it there. And one of the things that Milic does is he is right, okay, that's it, I'm proselytizing over by Betnaki. Like, this is where you're going to find me. And he spends all of his time talking to all the brothel workers there, trying to convert them. And it's really, really successful.
And of course, we also delve into the role of women in that period of Czech history. As Eleanor points out, their influence may have been hidden, but it was no less important.
It very well could be that he's getting great political advice from his wives. You would never write that down. You would never say, oh, and my queen told me to do this, because that would make you look weak. But that doesn't mean that it isn't happening.
I think what is really unique about Eleanor is how she is passionate about making history accessible and showing its importance in the modern world.
One of the reasons why I'm so passionate about Czech history and I'm so interested in it is I think that it is very often overlooked, despite being incredibly important.
So, whether you're on a walk, brewing up a cup of coffee or relaxing at home, get comfortable and join me for this journey into the medieval world through the eyes of Dr. Eleanor Janega. You are listening to Czechast and I'm Vít Bohanka.
Czechast, a podcast in English about all things Czech. Whether you're an English-speaking expat living in Czechia and Slovakia, or a descendant of the Czechs, Moravians and Slovaks who left for a better life in America, Australia, Britain or Canada so long ago that you don't speak the language of the old country, this podcast in English is for you.
My name is Dr. Eleanor Janega, and I am a medieval historian. I specialize in gender, sexuality, apocalypticism, propaganda, and urbanity in the Middle Ages generally, but my specialty is 14th century Bohemia.
As we are speaking, you are in London, I suppose, right?
I am indeed, yes.
But you grew up in Tacoma, Washington, and let me just mention, a few years back, I traveled along the Pacific Coast Highway all the way from Mexico to Canada. And I did have a wonderful time in the Olympic National Park. And in that part, I mean, it's a beautiful part of the United States. What drove you from one rainy place to another?
Well, yeah, I get made fun of a lot for that. It actually rains less here in London, but I was taken from Tacoma largely because I became a medieval historian, and we sort of keep all of that here in Europe. But it was an absolutely wonderful place to grow up. You know, as you mentioned, astoundingly beautiful, which I didn't appreciate at all as a child. I thought that, everywhere was a rainforest.
Yeah,
it's normal to have a giant mountain with snow on it all the time. And it was a really, kind of great classic American upbringing, lots of rock climbing, mountain climbing, a lot of outdoorsy things, very wholesome in that respect. And I'm from an enormous family, so a lot of running around with your cousins in the woods, that kind of a thing.
Do you remember when you first became interested in medieval history and history as such? Was there a moment? Was there a book? Was there a teacher?
I think that for me, the thing that began it all was actually Lego. When I think back, we had Lego castles when I was a child, and I really, really loved them, and I thought they were interesting. And we also had this series of books by an author called David Macaulay that were called things like Castle and Cathedral, and they gave these great illustrations of the insides of cathedrals and castles and explained how they were built. And so I built a lot of my imaginary world around these things. And I think then when I was about 6, my father began to read The Lord of the Rings to us. And then it was over. So I think that that's kind of just what happened to me. So, one baby step into another. And, oftentimes you start off with fairy stories and you end up with actual history.
So you kind of decided you wanted to study history and medieval history, right? Wasn't there a Chinese period in your life?
There was. Well? When I first went to university, I completely intended to study Chinese history. And off I went to university, and I got there and the university professor who specialized in China was on sabbatical. And they said, well, you can take anything you want. Go ahead. Here is the catalog of all the classes. And mostly on a whim, I kind of took a medieval history course because I thought, I love Lord of the Rings. I love castles, all of these things. This should be quite interesting. And I ended up just falling in love absolutely immediately, and all of my dreams of China just kind of became subverted, which is, perhaps easier for me. It's a little bit easier to learn Latin than Mandarin if you speak a European language already. So there was that in it for me.
What was the first time that you became interested in particularly Central European or Bohemian history?
Well, I was always particularly interested in it because of the family connection. My father's parents are immigrants. So my grandmother was Czech, my grandfather was Slovak, and they immigrated to the Dakotas, which was a rather popular thing to do for people from Central Europe, and then eventually ended up moving to Chicago, which was, again, one of the big destinations for Czech and Slovak immigrants. My father grew up in an area of town which is called the Little Village, and it was pretty much all Czech speakers. The local church was Blessed Agnes of Bohemia. And so I grew up sort of speaking baby Czech with my grandmother, which it turned out was very old-fashioned. I learned when I moved to the Czech Republic later. But I was always quite interested in this because it is more common in places like Chicago for people to be Czech, but on the West Coast, it was seen as a bit of an anomaly. So our last name kind of stood out a bit, and I developed a kind of thing about myself as being, Czech and or Slovak. I mean, when I was born, you could be Czechoslovakian. That was the thing. and I sort of was, right? So that was kind of a way that I thought about myself, in a way that I thought about my family. And when one begins to study the medieval period, this is a part of the world that is incredibly important. And I was so taken with the fact that somewhere where I really thought of my roots as being played such an integral part in medieval history. And that felt really magical to a certain extent. And I wanted to help illuminate that for people who don't have that same background. I'm just kind of a bit of a Czech evangelist at this point in time.
A little bit more about your background. I think you mentioned that your father was your father's family were from Western Bohemia. Do you know whereabouts?
Yeah, we are from near Tabor, and also kind of very close to Český Krumlov, like small towns and this sort of thing. But at Tabor in general, and then when we immigrated to South Dakota, we moved to Tabor again, which is not particularly imaginative of us, but there you have it. And it's because, everyone from Western Bohemia, when they moved over, were going there. So I think we were sort of maintaining family links and that sort of thing. On my Slovak side of the family, we're from a town called Bratislava, which is near Trenčín.
Sorry, did you say Bratislava?
Bratislava. Yeah.
Did you have a chance to visit the places where your family came from?
Yes, absolutely. One of the first things that I did was go to Tabor, and I spent rather a lot of time in Moravia as well, which I always joked was kind of halfway between the two. So I've been to Bratislava, I've been to Trenčín. I think my family worked in the castle there for a while. Which some of my relatives have attempted to dress up as us, being nobility, which we were not. But, the classic American thing of aggrandizing one's past. But I've kind of poked all around in the towns, and I still have cousins that I visit and that sort of a thing. So that's been lovely.
Now that you mentioned that you spent some time in Moravia, I understand quite close to the city, which is close to my heart, Olomouc. What were you doing there again? Jumping here a little bit, but...
absolutely fine, yeah. I was staying in a very small town, Przemyslovice, which is kind of halfway between Olomouc, halfway between Prostějov. And I was on an archaeological dig. We were doing Bronze Age burial mounds. And I was kind of cutting my teeth trying to figure out if I wanted to do more history or more archaeology. And what I discovered is if I was going to do archaeology, I'd much rather do it with a Czech team because you were kind of allowed to just sort of get in there with a pickaxe. And the Americans are very slowly brushing everything away, layer by layer. And I don't know, I wasn't sure that I really wanted to spend all of my time in a field in the forest. I was much more interested in hanging out in Prague. And so history won.
Is it for me, obviously, as a layperson, non-historian, is it still the case that if you go to Prague, you can actually get to texts and some things as a historian that you would still in this digital age find difficult to get to if you are in London or Chicago or somewhere else?
Well, I certainly, when I was doing my PhD, spent rather a lot of time at the Národní knihovna, not because the manuscripts that I wanted to use weren't digitized. They were. But at times it can be a little bit more difficult to read them. I wanted to make sure that I had my Latin exactly right. When things are written by hand, it can get a little bit smudgy, especially when you're working with 14th century secretary hand. So there were times when I had to come over and have a look at them directly, and I had to stick up for myself a little bit on occasion. I brought, introductory letters from my PhD supervisors and things of this nature to prove that I really ought to be allowed to handle these really quite priceless things. We are lucky that we are in an age where more and more things are digitized, and I think that's incredibly invaluable. It makes my work really a lot easier, but there are still times when nothing is going to beat sitting with the actual object.
When you say you went to the National Library, that would be Clementinum in Prague?
Yes.
Yeah. And where did you stay in Prague?
Well, I stayed in Vinohrady, so I used to live very quite near to Náměstí Míru, and so I like to be in Náměstí Míru whenever I visit still. Although once in a while, if I'm feeling a little bit more flash and I've got friends coming with me, I'll stay. I like, the Malá Strana as well. I think it can be quite cute. So that's nice. But most of my friends are in Vinohrady. That's where I hang out in general.
Yeah. And it's quite close actually to Czech radio building, Český rozhlas building, which is in Vinohrady too. Back to the history at 14th century. 14th century seems to be your favorite. Why? Why is that?
Because everything goes wrong. And what I say about that is, I think from my perspective of someone who is primarily a social historian, I'm interested in society, the way it sees itself, the things that people do. You really find out what people are like at their core when you put them in terrible circumstances. It's very easy to be a good Christian and, say your prayers every night and kneel by the side of your bed in the 12th century when everything is going right. The minute you have the Great Famine, the Black Death, all kinds of political turmoil, that's when you get to the heart of what people actually want and need. And then from the perspective of being a Bohemianist, we are also this really interesting outlier because we don't get as devastated by the Black Death as everybody else does. We're actually in a boom time in Prague in comparison to everyone else. You go to Florence and it's collapsing because everybody's died in the 14th century. You come to Prague and the population is doubling. It's the largest city north of the Alps. It's got all of this incredible trade happening. So it acts as a really interesting mirror image as to what's going on in the rest of Europe. And I find that absolutely fascinating.
I'm just wondering, how did Bohemia deserve to be this kind of island, not so much affected by Black Death and population doubling when the population was decreasing in other places?
I think that Bohemia
was it a coincidence, or
absolutely it was not a coincidence. I mean, it's kind of a coincidence about the Black Death, and we still don't know how exactly that happened. This isn't to say that there wasn't Black Death in Bohemia. It's very clear that it didn't kill anyone on the scale that it did everywhere else. Mm-hmm. When we see references in chronicles, they're like, oh yeah, they're having a bad time over in Italy. Anyway, these sorts of things, And so we don't really know why or how that happened. But there are certain things that we know would attract people. And one of the big things that, of course, happens is you get into the reign of Holy Roman Emperor Charles IV. Mm. And this is what is incredibly interesting to study for me, because it shows you how good governance and real planning of a place can make a huge difference for regular people as well. And that is why Prague manages to attract so many people. It's why it's got a great economy in terrible circumstances. And it becomes this place where beautiful things are still being made and indeed prioritized when, I don't know, France and England are busy bonking each other over the head with swords and, everyone's dying in a ditch and poor Italy is struggling under, lots and lots of civil wars. And then here's, Bohemia just quietly mining away and doing all kinds of interesting building projects. And I just think that's great.
Now, again, speaking as a layperson, I'm just wondering, you say mining away, but I think Kutná Hora was already beyond the kind of highest production of silver, wasn't it? Was it not?
It's true. You are absolutely right. It had already kind of tapered off a little bit, but there was still certainly silver coming out. And it had enough of a reputation that people considered that they ought to sort of keep going. And there's certainly also, then a desire to kind of go out and see where else one might mine. So this is when we also see the large expansion into, for example, Slovakia at the time in terms of mining, because people are looking for other sources. But there is an understanding that Bohemia is a place with riches, and also, that is, of course, helped by having a ruler who is absolutely paying. Right? You've got a ruler who's saying, "Hey, everybody, making a new cathedral, making several new churches. I'm building city walls. Any workers want to take this up?" And turns out there's a lot of people who did indeed want that.
Let's get to Charles IV. I actually listened to one of your podcasts where you delved really deep into how he became the Czech king. If you were kind of to sum it up for the listeners of this podcast, how did Charles become the Czech king? And obviously he had a Czech mother, but he's Charles of Luxembourg, isn't he?
Of course, yes. And I mean, one of the things that I find most interesting about him is the fact that he very desperately wanted to be a Czech king, because his mother, Elžbeta, of course, was attempting to stage a coup against John of Luxembourg, which, if I could do an alternative history, I wish that would have worked. I would have loved to see what had happened there, because I really hate John of Luxembourg. But, and of course, then Charles is sort of whisked away from his mother and taken to the French court with the idea that he shouldn't be around all this Bohemian riffraff, and all that John of Luxembourg wants to do with Bohemia is treat it like a bank account. He wants to go to jousting tournaments and act a fool and take money. So when Charles then comes back in, he has to make a conscious decision about whether or not he's going to rule in the way that his father did, which is as this sort of foreign overlord, or is he going to be Czech? And he says, no, I'm Czech. Even if he has to relearn the Czech tongue, as he himself puts it, he will do that. He spoke German, he spoke French, but it was a point of pride for him that he did the day-to-day running of the kingdom in Czech. And he spends a lot of time coming to grips with what it means to be Czech. And so as a result of this, you see an intense amount of emphasis on his Přemysl roots, very specifically trying to connect himself with St. Wenceslaus, with St. Ludmilla. He spreads their cults throughout Europe. So he very particularly attempts to get the cult of St. Wenceslaus off the ground in the German lands, as well as in Rome. So he spends all of this time not just saying, I get to rule you because I'm your ruler, deal with it. What he says is, I am a new example of what it can mean to be Czech. And not only that, I think we have a place within wider Europe. It's not that I'm some kind of outsider who's come in to Czech. I'm here to bring Czech out to the rest of the world. And I think that is incredibly inspiring. And, of course, of someone of Czech extraction, this is how we all wish to think of ourselves.
Obviously, Charles IV is often called the father of the Czech nation. You just, in a way, explained that. But how come this father of the Czech nation has got these sons who, I would say, completely squander? I mean, this great heritage that they had. And now I'm talking, just for the listeners, about his son Wenceslas IV and Sigismund afterwards.
Oh, I hate Sigismund. Both of these sons are awful. We have this term in English for children such as these, which is fail sons. The kind of terrible sons of great people who work and strive and are educated. And it's so interesting because they're given everything, and which isn't to say that Charles isn't. Of course, he grows up at the French court, is lavishly educated. But he also, I suppose, has something to strive for, which is he wants to be taken very seriously as, a Czech, as a man of God, as an emperor, as all of these things. And so he really has a project that he is working for. I think that the problem with both Wenceslas and Sigismund is they were given everything. Mm-hmm. And they never had to work.
Spoiled brats, basically.
Completely. They never had to think about it. It was just like, here you go. Like, you're growing up in one of the most cosmopolitan places of the world. Here's everything for you. Here are high-level marriages. Here's a beautiful city. You can just go ahead and be the emperor. You don't have to even worry about that. Dad has it all secured. And they just waste it because they never had to work. Now, having said that, I've got a good friend who works on the art of the court of Wenceslas IV. And to be fair, he had a great taste, but he wasn't much of a ruler. So that's just in case Jana Godzova is listening to this. Jana, don't make fun of me.
If you were to describe to the listeners what Prague was like, what it would look like then, what would it be if you walked around? Well, already there was Nové Město, which was founded then. What did it look like? What did it feel like? If you can try to give us a sense of the city then.
It's a real boom time, right? Where things are absolutely being built. So you're going to have a lot of older buildings, which sadly we don't have very many of them in Prague. I think our oldest extant building that hasn't really had to have much work is 1234 it was built. And so there's still lots of older buildings, older Gothic and Romanesque buildings, smaller houses. But one of the things that Charles wants to do is make a very specific effort to build Gothic style churches. And in particular, he fosters the creation of a form of Bohemian regnant architecture. So he brings in architects originally, from the German lands, but then they're eventually in Prague long enough that they invent their own things. So you have people like Peter Parler who are intentionally creating these new and beautiful buildings. And these are really some of the most iconic architecture that we all think of when we think of Prague. So things like, of course, the cathedral itself, but also Tin Cathedral was one of his works. Mm-hmm. So these huge monumental buildings are going up. One of the other things that's happening, as you've already alluded to, is the creation of the Novi Miesto. So what happens there is you have a huge new city wall that is built that kind of absorbs all the tiny little villages that were outside of Prague into it. And so this is kind of like a funny period of time because you just build a big wall around the tiny villages and then you begin paving everything. So he makes a big effort to pave these areas. So if you and I went to them at the time, we would think that there were not a whole lot of houses. There weren't a lot of buildings. But one of the big things that he does make an effort to do is aggrandize a lot of the churches there. So he'll kind of kick money to the local churches and say, oh, do you want a bigger church? A higher spire, things like that. He also does a good line of bringing in other religious orders that don't already exist in the city. And so this does a great job of kind of filling out the Novi Miesto. Suddenly you get a lot more monks and nuns around, and where there's a monastery, you're going to have a lot of auxiliary people who are attending to it. So that brings in more money. And so there's this big pull. But it is kind of an in-between time. It's not like now where, you can walk from, the Stare Miesto to the Novi Miesto and, it doesn't make that much of a difference to us. You would definitely see a decrease in buildings. Mm-hmm. But, the intent is there. And one of the things that's really quite interesting about the Novi Miesto is also, of course, Karlova Náměstí, which at the time is the largest market square in Europe. It's absolutely enormous. So one of the first things that gets built up is the dimensions of the square. And you build all of the buildings all around it. But then also we think in the middle, there was some kind of church that was possibly in the shape of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. And Charles would use this to put all of his relics on display and bring people in. So he did these incredible programs, like creating the Feast of the so-called Holy Lance and Nail, where he got the church to grant a jubilee to Prague, and pilgrims came from all over Europe to come see the imperial relics. And they put them on display in Karlova Náměstí up on this big platform in this church, and everyone would kind of file through to see them. And they say, the chroniclers, that all of Karlova Náměstí is full of people, just full of people. And when you think about it now, we kind of think about it a little bit more like a park. You wouldn't necessarily see it as a market where you would come to sell things. It's not like the Stare Miesto or something like that. But at the time, it is a lot more bustling. So we have to consider that this is kind of a change over time. Things are booming. Things are being built. Things are being created. But it isn't also at complete capacity yet, like it is now.
Let me ask you about one aspect of that time. Obviously, Charles IV traveled a lot, all the time. And I just wondered, do we know something about how Charles IV and, other people in those days, how they traveled?
Well, we know a little bit in terms of what his itineraries are. He does a great job of keeping us updated how he moves from place to place. And we know a lot from himself from his younger days about how he moves about. And he's usually on horseback, oftentimes with a lot of other young nobles his age. And of course, with that, you're going to have auxiliary people like servants that rich people don't deign to record in their own journals and this sort of thing. But we do know that oftentimes if he's moving about, particularly for military purposes, is usually in smaller groups. So he's kind of going places to meet his father or meet another army, and they pick up men along the way. And then when you are traveling with an army, that slows you down a little bit because you're on horseback, but most of the men are going to be walking. So you can kind of go ahead a little bit, and then you will stay in an inn or in the castle of a friendly noble or something like this, and you get to bed down for the night. You're kind of done at 4:00. And then the army slowly marches in until 8, and then they get what little sleep they can, and you wake up fully rested and do it again the next day. Now, when he has the retinue that he has as an emperor, this again comes into play. Because he will be traveling in some style, not necessarily because he is attempting to be particularly luxurious, but to prove that one is the emperor, one needs to behave as though one is the emperor. And so this means that you have to have, luxurious tents. You have to have really fine horses. You're going to have wagons that are going to bring along all of your cook's gear and just we call it a baggage train. Often there'll be several horses that are kind of bringing things along. And so if you've got a retinue of this size, you're going to be sticking more towards the flattest possible way of doing anything. And sometimes, of course, with this, if you can possibly, you'll get on a boat, which can be more common, especially in the German lands when you have waterways that can, navigate people very well, because that's the fastest way to travel. But because, he's the Holy Roman Emperor, he doesn't spend very much time, crossing seas or anything like that. So, he once in a while gets on a luxury barge, this kind of a thing. But for the most part, it's fairly slow going. And it's slow going because if you wanted to travel fast, well, why are you traveling fast? That kind of proves you're not the emperor, right? The emperor is a man of luxury who can take things very, very slowly and take his time and bring along everyone that he knows. So what we would say, if you can find a series of paths where things might branch off, he's always going to take the broadest one, the flattest one, even if it is less direct, because there are going to be so many people who are brought along with him.
In other words, he needs to show status along the way. I mean, so that people understand how important he is. And I'm just wondering, from the little I know about history, it used to be that the rulers had to be on the road because they needed to physically show their presence and to get whatever they needed. But during the time of Charles IV, this necessity wasn't as urgent, was it?
No, certainly not. And so the fact that he spends quite as much time on the road as he does is an anomaly. And I would argue, and certainly many historians before me have argued, that this is conscious. And it is because we are, at this point in time of the Holy Roman Empire, looking at a kind of diminished power base for the Holy Roman Emperor. Increasingly, you get your backing and your armies and things just from your Hausmacht, as it's called. So, for Charles, it would be drawing from Bohemia, drawing from Luxembourg, places like this. Whereas previously, when one was the emperor, it's just kind of understood that, yes, you have your own ancestral lands, but you get to dip in and out of taxation everywhere. So one of the things that Charles is sort of doing is saying, hello, it's me, I'm the emperor, and I'm here, and in incredible places too. He goes to far northern Germany, he goes to Lubeck, which everyone is shocked when he shows up in Lubeck. Everyone's like, what are you doing here? He goes to Rome, he goes to Milan, he goes to Arles. And part of that is simply showing his face and saying, yes, hello, I'm the emperor. But also there is a concerted program of crown collecting, because there is quite a lot of time when he is the king of the Romans, which is kind of step one towards becoming the Holy Roman Emperor, but he hasn't been crowned emperor yet. And so he spends a lot of time going to places like Milan to go collect the Iron Crown of Lombardy, just to make the point that, hello, everyone, I'm also the king of the Italians. I'm the king of the Lombards. He goes to Arles very specifically to be crowned there. So this is attempting to force the Pope's hand into crowning him emperor, which does in fact work. So everything that he does has some kind of loaded meaning behind it. And there is also, this idea that people are having in the 14th century where everyone's a little bit worried about the emperor perhaps falling apart, because there are some concerns that its administration hadn't been going particularly well. And, indeed, the fact that Charles and Louis the Bavarian were kind of at each other's throats and there was two emperors for a while doesn't bode very well, right? The Pope is over in Avignon, and people are kind of worried that this might be spelling the beginning of the end for the empire. And to them, this is not just a political worry, it's a theological one. And it feeds into ideas about the apocalypse. So Charles is kind of reassuring everyone that the world isn't ending. I am making sure that the empire is all together, and I am this consummate Holy Roman Empire. I am a consummate Holy Roman Emperor who understands the needs of all of his people, which is why I show up.
If we think about the society then, do you think that, I will call that common folk, for lack of better word, that they were aware that they were part of this greater, empire, of this kind of political structure? Do we know anything about that?
I mean, it's very difficult to tell. Unfortunately, one of the things that we get to hear least about is what ordinary people think. We can learn a bit more by looking at people who spend more time with common people. And in the 14th century, that is often people like popular preachers, because they're aiming very particularly at ordinary people with their sermons. They are aiming to bring in money by drawing in crowds, and the crowds that come in can be nobility, they can be royalty, but they're more likely to be an individual on the street. It's more likely to be people of this nature because, for lack of a better way of putting it, sermons are a valid form of entertainment in the 14th century. And so if you look at the work of popular preachers, you're a little bit better able to understand what the average person might be thinking about particular things. And that's quite interesting because they can be pretty politically involved.
You are listening to Czechast, a podcast in English about all things Czech. I'm Vít Bohanka, and my guest is Dr. Eleanor Janega, an American medievalist and broadcaster living in England with passion for Czech history.
Let me ask you about Jan Milic of Kroměříž, because your PhD thesis focused on him. If you were to introduce him again, who was he and why was he important? Why is he interesting for you?
He's just my favorite. Well, you asked, so now you're in trouble when I give you a long answer. But he is originally a Moravian priest, and he is the son of lesser nobility, and he begins to climb through the ranks of the church in Bohemia in the way that the son of lesser nobility does. So we think that he was originally attached to the cathedral at Olomouc, because, Kroměříž is where the summer palace for the Bishop of Olomouc is. And we know that he was originally in that retinue. And then he does well enough that he's invited over to Prague, and he begins to work at the Prague Cathedral. And we know that he is pretty high up with that as well. We think that he travels with the Archbishop's retinue when Charles is there, and so he may well have been known personally to him. But then he has a kind of sudden change of faith. Here he is kind of trying to make his way up through the structures of the cathedral, and he decides that it's all a bit too worldly. And he kind of retreats to the countryside, and he says that the Holy Spirit begins to speak within him. And he decides that what he needs to be doing is working with ordinary people. And he also becomes convinced that the world is ending and that Antichrist is going to show up at any moment. And so his concern is working with ordinary people to stem what he sees as a tide of sinfulness, which is going to unleash the apocalypse. And this means he ends up working, again, a lot with the cathedral, with people like this, fancy people up the top, but his day-to-day is with the ordinary citizens of Prague. And I am absolutely fascinated by him because I get to spend a lot of time seeing what he thinks about and see him not only work with ordinary people on the street, but also, write to the Pope, write to the Emperor, carry on these correspondences with some of the most important people in the world at the time. So he acts as a really wonderful bridge between regular people and the highest echelons of society.
So why would they answer? To this guy who works with the common people, why was he worth it? Why was he worth their time?
Well, I would argue, and indeed have done in my PhD, that part of the reason that they answer is that Charles sees him as a force for his own project. And this is kind of like a tit for tat situation. So in Milic's sermons, he talks all the time about the same sort of things that Charles likes. He writes very particularly about the Czech saints and how important they are. He's got lots of sermons on Wenceslas, on Ludmila. You name him, he's got them. He talks about how, the world is going to end. So I really think that one of the ways that we can stop this is that the papacy's got to come back from Avignon to Rome, which is one of the things that Charles also feels very strongly about. He says that the world needs to reorganize itself, and there needs to be a big synod where everyone in the church gets together and the Pope tells them to all stop being so naughty. But it shouldn't just be the Pope. It should be the Pope and the Emperor. So he is arguing that the emperor is as important as the pope, which is the number one thing that every Holy Roman Emperor loves, because the pope and the emperor are constantly battling about who made who, essentially. He is also working on the street in Prague to do certain projects that could be a little bit legally tricky for Charles. So when Charles, for example, builds the new town and he builds the new walls, this also has the consequence that it changes what the center of Prague was, right? Because if you double the size of the town, then suddenly the center is somewhere completely new, which is kind of like over near the old town walls. And there's an unintended consequence of this, which is it accidentally puts the red light district, where one of the really famous brothels, Betnaki, in the middle of the city. And, you know, all big imperial towns have lots of brothels. It's one of the features of urban life. It is just one of those things that you have to have, and they're probably legally bonded, we think. But they're not supposed to be in the middle of town, and they're not supposed to be in the middle of the town when you are saying, hi, everyone, it's me, I'm the Holy Roman Emperor, this is my new capital, and we are incredibly holy, and look at all these monks and nuns we have. So Charles is faced with this problem because he's got a brothel that is legally allowed to be there, but he doesn't really want it there. And one of the things that Milic does is he is right, okay, that's it, I'm proselytizing over by Betnaki. Like, this is where you're going to find me. And he spends all of his time talking to all the brothel workers there, trying to convert them. And it's really, really successful. So he starts being given the houses of smaller madams around the other brothel. Mm-hmm. You know, they have a change of heart and they say, oh, pray for me, Father, you can have my house. And he builds this small community, which he calls Jerusalem. So it's not like Venice, you know. And then eventually Charles is able to say, oh, look at all this wonderful work. We're all so moved that I'm donating the houses of Betnaki to you. And now it's this religious center. But it's not him coming in and making something illegal, which is traditional. He's saying, oh, look, the tide of public sentiment has just changed. And look, here's this preacher doing this amazing work. And then it allows him to get rid of something that is really uncomfortable while doing something religious, which is his favorite thing to do. So there are all these little projects that he gets to do in Prague at the time. And then, of course, Milic loves this. So then he's like, great, thanks very much, Charles. Let me write to the Pope again one more time about how great you are, right? Let me give another speech to everyone in Prague about our wonderful emperor and how holy he is and all the wonderful things that he's doing. And it doesn't just happen in Prague when you give a sermon like this. He also has what we call a scriptoria of other preachers he is training who are writing down every single sermon that he gives, and they're sending it out and they're publicizing it around the empire. And we know they get everywhere. So we find Milic's sermons in Rome, we find them in Avignon, we find them in the German lands. And so people are reading these and then giving those same sermons where they live in Germany. So it's a form of propaganda where hundreds upon hundreds of people are hearing these speeches all about how great the emperor is. And oh, have you heard of St. Wenceslas? You should really, worship St. Wenceslas, and it does something for Charles without him having to do it himself. So it just looks popular and it becomes popular. People just really end up quite liking Charles, which is odd for an emperor,
Just one thing that kind of came to my mind. Okay, if they were using Jan Milic's work in places like Rome or anywhere, did they attribute it to him, or did they just pretend that it was them who actually said that? Do we know?
We can't necessarily know.
No.
We know that the libraries will record it as being his sermons, and thank goodness they did, because otherwise I wouldn't be able to find them. But it might be that they would go out into the square and say, haha, I'm here to give this Jan Milic sermon, or they might just say, here's a great sermon. One way or another, for Charles, it doesn't necessarily matter. For Milic, it does, and he would rather that they attribute things to him. But he also travels. He goes to Rome himself at a point in time and does the thing of nailing to a door the sermon that you're going to give the day. Now, he immediately gets arrested for doing this because he's preaching on the Antichrist, and some Franciscans lock him up. But he also kind of loves that, I think. He likes the publicity of, oh, I was giving too scathing a talk about Antichrist and was arrested, and no jail can hold me kind of thing. And the Pope's brother steps in to have him freed. And so, but when you're having the Pope's brother step in, we know this is a guy that important people care about and think about. So he clearly has some form of fame. Otherwise, cardinals aren't coming to your rescue.
You know, what I think we people now in the 21st century perhaps underestimate is how the mind of people then, let's say in the 14th century, was concentrating on this, okay, there's heaven and there's hell. I mean, people really believed, there's God, and there must have been a constant kind of doubting, whether am I doing the right thing? Am I doing the wrong thing? Am I right? But to what extent do you think Charles IV was just, I don't want to say cynically, but pragmatically using the church, for his purposes in this sense? To influence the masses, or at least the people who were in Prague, or that he needed to persuade that he was really important and that they should listen to him.
I think that is something we're never going to really know, but I would argue, yes, absolutely, he knows what he's doing. And this isn't to say that I do not believe that he isn't sincerely religious. I think that he is a deeply spiritual person who genuinely believes in the Catholic Church, in his place within it, and his ability to do the right thing as a Christian. But that can also favor his own political projects as well. So I think that he believes that the Catholic Church ought to be doing particular things, and he uses it to do the things that he wishes. So he wants the papacy to return to Rome from Avignon. And he doesn't ever get his wish in his lifetime, unfortunately for him. But that isn't something that you push for unless you actually care. If he didn't particularly care about the church one way or another, he'd be like, yeah, stay in Avignon. I don't care. You're rich. I'm rich. We're all having a nice time in various palaces. That wouldn't be something that would come up. You would certainly see probably the same collection of wealth that he does. But one of the things that he tends to do on his travels everywhere he goes is collect relics. And if he shows up at your castle, he's not necessarily going to want you to give him a gift of a necklace or something like that. But if you have a saint's relic, he's absolutely coming for that. He's going to guilt you until you show him your saint's finger, and then he's going to collect it and bring it back to Prague. And of course, that does two things. It makes Prague more holy because he has this incredible collection of relics, but he really believes in them as relics, I would argue. So he is just very astute. And I think that he wants all of these things because he is religious, but he also wants himself to be centered within this, because that simply is the role of the Holy Roman Empire. And, there's all different ways to be a Holy Roman Emperor. You could be like Louis the Bavarian and get in a fight with the papacy and make a Franciscan your anti-pope and go on bear hunts all the time. Or you can be like Charles and build new cities, consecrate churches, collect relics, and these things are choices. And so he makes particular ones that are very religious, I think, because he believes in it, but also he sees it as politically expedient. He's a complex man and does a lot of things.
One last thing about Charles IV. I was never quite sure to what extent what he did in Prague and in Bohemia, to what extent it reflected the trends that were already in, let's say, in Western Europe, the rise of the cities, or was he actually introducing something that spilled over, to other places?
That's a great question.
Or was it a simultaneous process? I don't know. The idea, I'm sorry, just to finish, what I learned at school, I remember back in the 1970s and 80s, even under communism, Charles IV was always the great father of the nation. We were basically told that he brought the big world to Prague. What's your answer to that?
It's a great question. And fundamentally, Prague had been going through some pretty hard times before he showed back up. And, this is partially his father's fault. because he just didn't care. And so he kind of just rode off. And so that meant that things were going a little bit downhill. There were problems with lawlessness on the roads. A lot of the
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I wouldn't like to lose this. I think in your podcast you said that John of Luxembourg was using Bohemia as an ATM machine.
Yeah, I will absolutely say, yeah. So
things go downhill. Yeah.
So things have really gone downhill, and part of the reason is that John of Luxembourg sees Bohemia as an ATM. So what he wants to do with it is he wants to take money out of it. He mortgages most royal property. He is absolutely not interested in any projects that are going to build Bohemia or Prague up. He barely shows up. This is why they call him a Jan Cizinec, because they're just like, yeah, well, there he is, maybe every 10 years he shows up and tries to collect more taxes, but he doesn't care. And things have kind of gone into a state of decline. The nobility are doing very well out of this, but, of course they're not in Prague. They're out in their own Prady, wherever, and, so that means when Charles shows back up, things are in a general decline, and Prague has slightly been off the map. And of course, this has had the result that Kutnora has been making a play that they're saying, we should be the number one city of Bohemia. We're the ones that have all the silver here. And that's when you kind of have that rivalry happening, and that's part of the reason. So Charles's return, it might be slightly exaggerated because it might be part of Charles telling the great story of Charles about how decrepit everything was when he gets back to Prague. But we do know that the Rajani, at the very least, is in such a state of disrepair that he's living on the square in the Stare Miesto. Like he's not back up at the castle. So there are clearly a lot of things that need to be done. And, he comes in and he's got sort of French ways of doing things, and he brings these very specifically French things into the mix. And that is interesting because, traditionally, obviously, Bohemia is very linked to the German lands, and, kind of the way you do things is you look at what the Germans are doing and the Germans look at what the Czechs are doing, and there's a lot of back and forth there. But to bring in all of these fancy influences from France, now we're talking, right? And this is a man who's got the ear of the French court because that's where he grew up. And it really explodes Prague onto the scene. But it's also a part of a really concentrated program that Charles does. So it's not just that he's building things up, he's managing to attract people to come see Prague. Come see it as this new and incredible city where we have the best of everything. We've got the best religion, we've got the best architecture, we've got the most important court. This is what it means to be a city. And we definitely do see other cities kind of up their game a little bit. Like, for example, Vienna suddenly is like, we've got to get a bigger city. We've got to get more churches down here, and they start kind of building things as well. And it kind of starts a little bit of a building boom in other places where they have the people and the power to do it. But also, here's Prague booming and expanding and doing really well when everyone else is just, dead of the plague and kind of trying to pull themselves together. Rome is having a terrible time with civil wars. London is London, but they've been really hit hard by the plague. So it's kind of like, Paris, Prague at the time. And I think that's really cool and very, very interesting.
Now, let's turn page, so to say. You often, as you mentioned, sexuality, gender in the medieval period, that's your interest as well. So how were these concepts viewed in the 14th century Bohemia, if we stay in this period? And do we know something how Charles IV's court was kind of influenced, how he dealt with the things like gender? Obviously, I suppose all the people around him, the people of importance, there were no women. Were there any?
He doesn't tend to have women advisors on the record that we know of. But we can certainly see that he spends rather a lot of time and effort into educating his daughters. which becomes very interesting and important. So, for example, when Anne is married off as the Queen of England, well, first, everyone can't believe that he's done this. So you can't send an empress to London. That's ridiculous. That's a ridiculous thing to do. You can't send her to a whole like London once she's been living in Prague. My God, and they have to seriously send a delegation to London to make sure that it's fit for her to live in, So off Anne goes to London, and she plays an incredibly important role at court because her husband's a moron. And she is this well-educated Czech princess who speaks 7 languages, knows everything about politics, can write letters back and forth. And she, time and time again, basically saves the kingdom from her husband, who's a moron. He does things like he tries to bankrupt London because they turned him down for a loan. And she has to be like, and go in and do a big public ceremony on her knees and beg him to forgive London, so that he doesn't completely destroy the entire economy. Because she's smart enough to be like, no, this is our important port, So we can see from the women who grow up with him that he is cranking out very smart women, right? And certainly we can see he has interest in holy women because he is super involved in spreading the cult of Catherine of Siena. That's one of his special saints, like Sigismund and like Wenceslaus. Catherine of Siena is another one of his big ones. He names one of his daughters Catherine. So he has a particular interest sometimes in femininity in these particularized ways. So that is an incredibly interesting thing to see, but it's also pretty common. And the story of women in the Middle Ages is that they are sort of always there, but we don't always get to hear from them. So it very well could be that he's getting great political advice from his wives. You would never write that down. You would never say, oh, and my queen told me to do this, because that would make you look weak. But that doesn't mean that it isn't happening. And indeed, having women in and about the court playing highly important political roles and doing deals is so common that it's not worth recording. It's just assumed that women are going to be around and women are going to be helping out. So, why would you bother to mention anything about it? So it's kind of two things at the same time. Women are considered important and do political things, but they're not important enough to record doing them. And that is absolutely maddening, right? So at the same time, on a much lesser scale, from 14th century Prague, one of the documents that I do a lot of work with is the Archbishop's diaconate protocol, which is done at the end of the 14th century, where they bring in a new archdeacon and they say, okay, well, you know what we're going to do? We're going to go door to door to every parish in Prague, which there are a lot of, and we're going to ask them if they have any theological problems that need fixing. And it's quite interesting because when they complain about men in their neighborhood, you usually get the man's full name, right? You'll find out that somebody's priest is consorting with in the brothel, and he's down in the brothel, and we know exactly who that is, and we'll get his name written down. But when we find that people are concerned that brothel workers are living in their neighborhood and shouldn't be there, we don't know their names, right? Mm-hmm. They'll complain about these women who are doing things that we don't particularly like, but they won't name them. We only have sort of like 5 women's names in the whole thing. So even when it's women behaving badly, we don't name them, right? They're more of a feature of society than members of society. And that's what makes it very, very difficult for us to find out more, because they kind of come into the record when they're being incredibly astonishing and, the best that anyone could ever be. And then everyone says, oh, we have to write about Catherine of Siena right now. Or they come into the record when they're being the absolute worst. And people are like, this girl is drunk at noon and attempting to seduce priests in the street, and so there's kind of like no way to hear about the average woman who is a businesswoman, who, runs a farm, who does all of these interesting things. And we have to work very hard indeed to find out more about them.
In your podcast, TV work, quite often you debunk various myths about the Middle Ages in general. If you were to name some of the myths that persist, perhaps, particularly as concerns Prague, and if you were to tell the listeners about, or debunk for the listeners, the most popular myths about Prague in the Middle Ages in general, particularly in the 14th century, what would you say?
So I would say one of the things that we have to be very careful about is not letting Charles's propaganda get to us as well, right? So I've spent this entire time saying, didn't Charles do a great job making Prague wonderful? And he did, right? But one of the big things that he wants everyone to know is, it's this special holy place and everything is so wonderful. And look at all of our churches. And we do, we look at all of these incredible churches every day and we marvel at them and we love them. But this is also a place that's got a lot of gambling going on. It's still a place that has lots of brothels. It's still a place where people act like regular people. And one of the most important things to consider about the Middle Ages is we read lots from what the church wants us to do. And I've spent this entire interview talking all about what the church wants and what religion means and how people think about things. But just like now, people will be like, yes, I'm very holy, I'm very religious, I think about Jesus, and they'll go out and cheat on their wife. People will know what the church wants them to do and they'll still eat meat during Lent. They will know that there are all of these rules, but at the end of the day, they're humans. And so they behave in all kinds of weird and wonderful ways, knowing fully well that this might get them in trouble later. And it's that knowing that you might get in trouble later, which is why people show up to things like the Holy Lance and Nail, because they're like, I've been sinning. So, I'm going to try, I just need to knock a little bit of my time in purgatory off by going to see these relics and praying with Charles IV and his son Wenceslaus, because I don't live my life like that. So it is true that it's an incredibly religious place and people all believe in God, but that doesn't mean they're all acting like they believe in it. And those are two separate things. And I think that's really, really important to keep in mind.
When we talk about religion, I always wonder to what extent the roots of the Hussite movement of Jan Hus and his teachings were kind of seeded, the ideas and everything in the time of Charles IV. Was that a part of the story, do you think, of the Hussite movement and the later Hussite wars and what was happening at the beginning of the first half, basically, of the 15th century?
I think that we can see a lot of the things that will turn in to Hussitism. And indeed, that's how I got interested in Milic in the first place, because I had been quite interested in the Hussite thinkers, but I wanted to go a bit earlier. And Milic is very, very different from the Hussites in a lot of ways, because obviously he's very pro the church, he's very pro Charles. But what I argue is that he's very pro the church and he's very pro Charles because he says, I see where things are going. Here are all of these problems. These need to be fixed. And they can be fixed. And I know that they can be fixed because there are rulers like Charles, which mean that sometimes people listen. And if we all just get together and stop where this is going, we can make a better society. When you get to the 15th century, clearly the Hussites are like, are you joking? Wenceslaus IV, we can't negotiate with this man. This man doesn't care at all about making a better and holier and fairer society. Why would we think that at all? The church is only getting worse. The church is only getting more profligate. They're not listening to any of these things. We have to make a break. So I think Milic is symptomatic of a lot of the problems that Hus understands to be true. And Milic was just quite hopeful and thinking that things would get better. But you have kind of a series of worse rulers. You have the church doubling down on all of its issues. Eventually you end up with more than one pope, which, the Hussites are like, what am I meant to do with this? So you're telling me that this is holy? I don't believe it. And whether you're talking about either Wenceslaus IV or Sigismund, they're both terrible rulers, and I certainly wouldn't look to them to create any kind of Christian heaven on earth. So it's a part of a continuum. And I think perhaps if Charles's sons had been less worthless, you might not have got the Hussites because things could have been curtailed. But this is what happens when you ignore people, right? And Czech people had money and were smart. And if you create a big and important international city, you're going to fill it full of big important international thinkers. And that's how you get Hussites,
Why didn't you become primarily interested in the Hussites when it really started happening? And why did you?
Oh, I sideline in that. I still am very, very interested in the Hussites. I've got actually a chapter in a book about apocalypticism coming out, and it was very funny because I was initially brought in to write the chapter on the Hussites, and then they forgot that they'd also asked someone else, which I thought was very funny. I was like, how have you ended up with more than one of us? And so I said, it's okay. I'll do Milic and Janov. It will be fine. And I'm still very interested in them, and I still do a lot of work on them. And actually, one of the big things that I try to do with English-speaking audiences is tell them about the Hussites, because I think that people are kind of scared of learning more because they're worried I'm going to make them learn Czech, and I am going to make them learn Czech. But first I'll translate it all for them. It's going to be fine. But I find the Hussites absolutely fascinating. I think that it is one of the most important things that ever happened in Europe. I find the thinkers incredibly important, and of course, as a Taborite, I'm very interested, very particularly in the Taborites. So, for me, that is always something that is happening. It's just that I got a little sidetracked because I just like Charles IV so much.
It's a great story. Let me tell you a little bit of story as well. I spent some time as a correspondent in Warsaw, in Poland. And our neighbor started asking us why we were not going to church. And I didn't know what to say at first. And then I said, my jesteśmy luterani, wie państwo. We are Lutherans, which is, Protestants, which still, even today in Poland,
Boże mój.
they are the Protestants. But my daughter went to school, and they had this religious education in Poland, which I actually found out. And I will say it plainly. I thought it was a kind of Catholic brainwashing. And my mother is Czech Brethren Church. She's a Protestant. So my daughter knew that her grandmother was a Protestant. But she didn't understand it. She thought there was only the Catholic Church after 1 year of this religious education in Poland, now in the 21st century. And I had to explain to her that that her grandmother is okay, even if she's not Catholic. Oh, no. But she asked me, so when did the church actually? And after some explanation, blah blah blah, there was one church, and then there were these Hussites and other later on Protestants. And she asked me, when did they start calling the church Catholic, actually, because during the time of Charles IV, there was still only one church, no?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah,
and I frankly, I have to say, I didn't know what to answer.
So the answer is, it basically takes the invention of Protestants, and that isn't to say that as soon as we come up with Hussitism, we start saying the Catholic Church. They tend to call the Hussites the heretics. And then the Hussites will tell you, no, we're just Christians. And that's that. But it's basically when Martin Luther comes on the scene and they want to have a way of differentiating themselves. So at that point in time, that's when you get references to Catholicism. So it's not until the 16th century that we come up with that. And indeed, it we wouldn't say Orthodox either at the time. No one would say, oh, over in Greece, they are all Orthodox, but everyone would understand that they were Eastern. That's usually what they would say, or they would say that they are Greek Rite, oftentimes, in order to differentiate, in the same way that there were sometimes Slavonic Rite people, who Charles brought to Prague, where occasionally there would be other ways of doing Christianity, but it was still understood as being under the broad umbrella of Christendom.
I'm sorry that I dragged you down to this level, which I can probably look up somewhere on the Wikipedia or something.
Not at all.
Of your stature. I've already taken so much of your time, but do you see perhaps something that you would like to convey to the listeners why Bohemia was exceptional? I don't want to make this kind of nationalist, sounding because it's called Czechast. But is there something special about the Czech lands in general and its history, not just medieval, that you find there's like a red thread, still line going on, continuation, of this old tradition?
I think so. Obviously I'm biased, so I'm a difficult person.
You are biased too.
I'm biased too, of course. But one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about Czech history and I'm so interested in it is I think that it is very often overlooked, despite being incredibly important in terms of overall European history. You cannot explain the Holy Roman Empire without constantly talking about Bohemia, and yet people attempt to do so. You cannot explain how trade routes work or how money is getting from one place to another. Just the presence of silver in Europe is down to Bohemia at the time. And that importance certainly carries on into the Baroque period. I mean, all one needs to do is look around Prague and see how important it was at the time. And certainly even under like the Habsburgske, it maintains a very important role worldwide. And what I feel passionate about is explaining to people that the world as it is now is not the world as it always has been. And just because we don't necessarily think of Bohemia as the most important place now, doesn't mean that that is a matter of historical fact. And it was incredibly important. It was incredibly impactful in terms of thinkers and producers and cultural tastemakers within Europe in general. And I want people to know that this is a history that is for them as well. Obviously people like me who have family get interested in it, but the history of Bohemia is the history of Europe. And if you're interested in the history of Europe, you should be interested in the history of Bohemia and Moravia as well. I keep leaving poor Moravia out. I love Moravia. But this is something that means if you don't understand it, you will never understand European history as a whole. And so, yes, I think it's special. Yes, I think it is a really interesting case, but that means that it is important for everyone, not just us.
Dr. Eleanor Janega, well, thank you so much for your time.
I really appreciate you having me on. It's always a pleasure to talk about Czechs with Czechs.
That's it for this episode of Czechast. A huge thank to Dr. Eleanor Janega for sharing her insights and passion for Czech history. If you are interested in her work, you will find literally tons of her podcast and television work on your podcast platform or YouTube. Just search for her name, Eleanor Janega, or go directly to History Hit podcast Gone Medieval. But next time, we'll turn to something completely different. My guest will be Jakub Mayer, a successful Czech businessman and activist who has taken a stand against government plans to establish a new national park in Křivoklátsko near Prague. Jakub will explain why he opposes what he considers the Czech state's bureaucratic overreach into an already protected landscape area. I think his story offers a very fresh and insightful perspective on how civic society in today's Czechia is thriving. If you enjoyed this or other episodes of Czechast, please don't forget to like, follow, or even share the podcast. It really helps others discover the show. And if you have comments, ideas, or suggestions, I'd love to hear from you. Until next time, stay curious, take care, and as always, naslyšenou.
Czechast, a podcast in English about all things Czech. Whether you're an English-speaking expat living in Czechia and Slovakia, or a descendant of the Czechs, Moravians and Slovaks who left for a better life in America, Australia, Britain or Canada so long ago that you don't speak the language of the old country, this podcast in English is for you.